Good afternoon, and welcome to the latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I'm Ron Granieri, a senior fellow at FPRI, and all of us at FPRI thank you for joining us live on Zoom and recorded on the FPRI YouTube page. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the bipolar Cold War, the United States enjoyed decades of unparalleled influence as the sole remaining superpower. For a variety of reasons, that era has come to an end. The future is multipolar, with multiple powers jockeying both for control of their immediate spheres of influence and for global advantage. Right now, that means a more complicated world in which Russia and China are emboldened to pursue their interests and challenge the Washington-led international order. Formal strategic documents, such as the United States' 2022 National Security Strategy, recognize this fact, noting that the United States faces not only the immediate challenge of Russia, newly aggressive in its efforts to reverse decades of decline and regain control of its near abroad, but also the pacing challenge of China, who looks to match, if not surpass, the United States in power and influence. If Russia and China each challenge that world order, however, it is unclear how the two revisionist powers see each other. Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have celebrated their no limits partnership, but for two states with a conflicted past that each celebrate sovereignty and individual national interest, it remains to be seen how such a partnership will develop. Thankfully, FPRI's Robert Hamilton, in his new book, The China-Russia Relationship, The Dance of the Dragon and the Bear. I had to check to see who comes first, one of the things we're going to talk about in this discussion. Bob talks about the global activities of these two challengers to American power, probing whether this is an alliance of convenience or a long-term relationship or somewhere in between. So what do Russia and China want? Will their cooperation outlast American hegemony? And what does this mean for American foreign policy? These questions and yours will guide us in our conversation with Robert Hamilton. Colonel, retired Robert Hamilton, PhD, there's a lot of accents around Bob's name, is the head of research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute's Eurasia program. In a 30-year career in the U.S. Army, spent primarily as a Eurasian Foreign Area Officer, Dr. Hamilton served overseas in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Germany, Belarus, Qatar, Afghanistan, the Republic of Georgia, Pakistan, and Kuwait. A graduate of the German Armed Forces Staff College and the U.S. Army War College, where we once were both colleagues in the Department of National Security and Strategy. Dr. Hamilton holds a Bachelor's of Science degree from the United States Military Academy and both an MA in Contemporary Russian Studies and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Virginia. He's the author of numerous articles and monographs on conflict and security issues, focusing primarily on the former Soviet Union and the Balkans. And we are delighted to have him with us on People, Politics, and Prose. Welcome, Bob.
Ron, thank you so much for the honor of this invitation. I'm really excited to be with you and to talk to you about the China-Russia relationship. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. So the audience has heard your bio and mighty impressed they are, I am sure. But could you tell us a little bit about how you got from West Point to being the author of the China-Russia relationship?
Well, sure. Well, I'm old, so it's a long trip. I don't know how much time we have, but yeah, so actually my journey to sort of becoming a Eurasian FAO, which was critical to sort of developing expertise on Russia, interest on Russia, and then eventually into this project, really began with my father. My father was a Soviet Foreign Area Officer way back when they launched the program. He was in the initial cohort of Soviet Foreign Area Officers in the early 1970s. And the only reason he was able to do that is because he grew up fairly poor in Charleston, South Carolina, and all he ever wanted to do in life was attend the Citadel, but his parents didn't have any money. And the Citadel's a private, expensive military academy, and so he joined the Air Force as an enlisted person. They trained him in Russian, sent him to Crete to listen to Soviet ships and aircraft in the Mediterranean. And at some point, the Air Force did what all services do. They do these batteries of standard tests. And in Crete, his commander came to him and said, hey, you scored high enough on this test to go to West Point. And he said, well, what's West Point? And his commander said, well, it's a military academy. And my dad said, I can't go. I don't have, we don't have any money. And his commander said, no, it's free, which obviously got his attention. So long story short, he ended up at West Point, but he had already been trained, and then he went into the Army, was an artillery officer, but he had already been trained in Russian language. So when they launched the FAO program, the Foreign Area Officer program in the early 70s, all he needed to do was go to U.S. Army Russian Institute in Garmisch, Germany, now the Marshall Center, for his regional training, and then go to get his master's in Russian, which he did here in Philadelphia, here at Penn. So he got his master's at Penn in the early 70s, and he was a FAO. And so I grew up, as I was getting old enough to be cognizant of what he did, he was in the Soviet FAO jobs and community. And so that always interested me. And then when I graduated from West Point and joined the armor, I went a different direction than he had. He'd gone artillery. I was in armor cavalry. But in the back of my mind, there was always this idea that when it came time and I was able to choose to go on the FAO track, that I would. And so I did. And then that led into the latter half, or latter 2/3 of my career, really, which was spent mostly working in and on the former Soviet Union. And then that landed me there at the Army War College and the PhD program there. And then through that, I got the affiliation with FPRI, and FPRI was critical in sort of encouraging me and assisting me with this book project in putting together the proposal to the Smith Richardson Foundation, and then managing the grant and keeping me on track and on schedule and making sure this book got written and published. So, it's really a story of sort of family ties and then professional affiliation and professional ties from the Army and from FPRI that resulted in this book.
It is a fascinating thing. Careers are fun to trace the trajectory, right? Once you get someplace, right, you could tell a story that explains why you inevitably got to where you are, but having lived it, you understand just how non-inevitable many of those steps were, right?
Absolutely. No, absolutely.
Well, and related to that, so like when you were, like your father, when he became, by the time he retired from the Army, when he retired, the Cold War was still going on, or did he make it to the end of the Cold War?
He retired in 1988. So he
Okay.
retired. The Soviet Union still existed, would exist for 3 more years, but it was clearly at that point already crumbling. Soviet power was already starting to crumble. It was already starting to lose control over some of the Union republics on the periphery, and so it was clear what was happening. As you said, it wasn't clear where it would end.
Right.
But it was clear that the Soviet Union there were going to be fundamental changes when he retired.
Right. Because that's always the challenge too, is that our study of, especially in our armed forces and in our government, right, our study of Russia and the Soviet Union went through peaks and valleys, right? That after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was let's say a major ebbing of interest in Russia that came back in let's say after the turn of the century, and certainly in the past, let's say 15 years. And so for you, was learning Russian sort of an obvious choice? Once again, the inevitability question, because of what your father did, or how did you maintain the enthusiasm for learning Russian at a time when people were probably telling you, Bob, you should be learning Arabic, you should be learning Chinese, you should be learning Spanish?
Yeah, actually, when I joined the FAO, when I applied for the Foreign Area Officer program, it was the late 90s, and the Balkans were all the rage, right? Everything that was happening in the Balkans, and so I originally had hoped to be a Balkan FAO, just because that, which means a European FAO, but you can specialize in subregions. And this is again a case where my father had influence and sort of said, well, I know that the Balkans are on the radar right now, but and I know that Russia's not. This is in like 1996, 7, 8. But he said, no matter what, the Balkans are eventually going to be solved. But no matter what direction Russia goes, it's a really big country and it's going to matter. So just think about that as you make your choice. So I thought about it, and I called up the Army and said, can I switch to Eurasia and Russia? And they said yes. And so again, and I think in retrospect, I think it was the right move. Now, the Army has since combined the region, so Europe and Eurasia are one mega region in terms of Foreign Area Officer program. So you could be a Foreign Area Officer and be in Dushanbe, Tajikistan, and then have your next assignment be in London, which to me is a little sort of incongruous, and maybe we've lost some of that regional specialization. But for most of my career, if you were a Eurasia specialist, you were going to be working in or on the former Soviet Union.
Right. I mean, that was even my feeling when I first started with FPRI, that Eurasia kind of meant the former Soviet Union. It was Russia and the former Soviet republics of Central Asia and the Caucasus. And go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, this, Ron. In the regional studies program at the Army War College, we have a Eurasia course, and the first thing we spend almost an entire 3-hour lesson talking about what is Eurasia, because there are that definition, the 15 republics of the former Soviet Union, is one, and it's workable. But my sense is Eurasia is actually larger than that. It's those 15 countries and the countries that influence and are influenced by them. So certainly you've got all the former Warsaw Pact countries. You've got Turkey, you've got Iran, you've got Afghanistan, you've got China, right? I would put those in broader or larger Eurasia. Certainly those countries are part of the discussion, and they matter.
Well, and this gets into a question about this particular book and this kind of a project, right? Whenever I teach a class on Europe, I always try to get students to tell me where's the border between Europe and Asia. And the truth is, right, nobody knows where it is, right? Because the Russians would argue with us intensely whether the border between Europe and Asia is it the Vistula or is it the Pacific? So this does get back to the question of when the Russians turn eastward, they turn eastward sometimes in search of compensation for thwarted ambitions in Europe, but then they end up running into the Chinese. And through much of the 19th century and the early 20th century, the Russians simply assumed that they would be the senior partner in any relationship with the Chinese. They're still partnering with the Chinese ways, but the situation is very different. So when you approach this question of the China-Russia relationship, what role does history and especially, let's say, cultural assumptions play in the relationship between the Russians and the Chinese?
I'm glad you asked that, because I got a great quote from the Chinese defense attaché in the U.S. on exactly that subject. I had, through an FPRI connection, I was able to get a meeting with him, a lunch meeting with him and his assistant. Well, I will paraphrase what he said, because I don't want to put him on the spot. But
sure.
And we were talking about the book project, and I was explaining that I'm doing a current study of sort of regional, how China and Russia interact in different regions of the world, because my sense is you can tell more about the relationship by looking at how they interact on the ground in regions where they both have important interests at stake than reading the Xi Jinping Putin summit communiques or looking at the trade data or all these other indicators. And he said, yeah, that's true. But he said, taking an only contemporary approach is limited, because you miss then some of the long-term historical, cultural drivers of the relationship. And that caused me to sort of think he's correct, because during the Cold War, I mean, we assumed that there was this hegemon, or this sort of monolithic Marxist communist empire between Beijing and Moscow. And in truth, by the mid 60s, they had fallen out. Right, Mao was really upset with Khrushchev's de-Stalinization campaign. He thought that the Soviets had strayed from the true path of socialism. And by the late 60s, they were shooting at each other on their common border. So he's right, and he's not the only senior official from either of those countries that have made that point, that you've got to look at the historical context too. These two countries are where they are. But if history's a river, which I've heard, you're a historian, I'm not, I'm a political scientist, but you got to look upriver a little bit to see how they got where they are now.
Yeah, for sure. And the idea that they're aware of that, and we should be aware of that too when we're trying to explain this relationship, which gets into one of the interesting aspects of your book, right? There are many, for those of you who are planning on reading it, which you should, but that you make the decision that while there are lots of sort of abstract arguments about the nature of their relationship, but you've decided to look at how this relationship is playing out on the ground. One of the phrases that we use at FPRI a lot, right? We borrowed from Jim Kurth, right? That we study the mentalities of the localities, right? Is one of the things that we do here. And you've taken the time to look at different regions of the world and say, okay, rather than speak abstractly about the China-Russia relationship, let's look at the places where they're both active and see how they are relating to each other. So what led you to decide to organize the book that way?
I think it was a couple of things. First of all, I wouldn't call it frustration, but I would call it sort of this idea that the two dominant paradigms that scholars look at the China-Russia relationship through are probably not going to get us to a real fundamental understanding of the relationship. And those are the strategic partnership, axis of convenience paradigms, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
This debate has been going on for nearly 20 years. It started in the early 2000s. Bobo Lowe, is an Australian scholar, wrote a book, Axis of Convenience, in 2008, that made the point that we shouldn't worry as much as we do about this budding alliance or strategic partnership, because really it's an axis of convenience, and here's why. And then there's a camp that says, no, it's a true strategic partnership. In my sense, is that it's probably neither, right? Like most, those are ideal types. They're useful because they frame the debate,
Right.
but then the truth usually lies somewhere in the middle. And the idea was, so why this approach to the book? Partially wanting to take a different approach than the axis of convenience strategic partnership debate, because my sense was that debate had mostly played itself out and nobody was going to win it unless something major happened in their relationship. But also just that, although those are nice sort of bumper stickers or ideal types to describe the relationship through, it was really like any relationship between any two countries, but particularly between two large major powers. It's complex, it's dynamic, and it's contingent. So it's complex because they interact, across what we would call the instruments of power, diplomatically, informationally, militarily, and economically. It's dynamic because it changes it changes in response to things that happen inside Russia and China, but also to things that happen in the world. And it's contingent because contingency happens on the ground. And these are two countries that are on the ground in a lot of regions of the world, and sometimes they're operating together, not necessarily formally together, but they're present, pursuing their interests in all sorts of different regions of the world. And their presence in those regions can lead to the relationship either strengthening or eroding the relationship. And so I wanted to examine that whole process and see what it looked like from the perspective of the regions where the Chinese and Russians were interacting.
Right. Well, and so that raises the question. You look at Africa, you look at Central Asia, you look at the Asia Pacific, you look at Latin America, which is there a pattern you see in the areas where China and Russia work better together versus worse together?
Yeah, the pattern is the United States, the presence or absence of the U.S.
Fair, yes.
I mean, we've been called the binding agent in the relationship. And so if you look at the regions, I looked at, as you said, I looked at Africa, I looked at Central Asia. I was going to look at Eastern Europe a little more broadly, sort of it used to be called the 17+1, the Chinese sort of outreach to those, to that group of countries between the Baltic and the Black Seas. But I really, as I was researching and then writing the book, the war in Ukraine broke out, the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. And to me, that's almost a perfect natural experiment for this relationship. So rather than look at Eastern Europe more broadly, I looked at China's response to the invasion of Ukraine, because I think that tells us a lot. And then so that Africa, Central Asia, the Ukraine conflict, and then East Asia, or what the Department of Defense calls the Indo-Pacific, were the four regions I looked at. And you actually find different things in every region, which again, I didn't know what I'd find, to be honest. I had some idea, but there were some surprises. And as I said, different regions yield different insights. And so again, because this relationship is not one size fits all, it doesn't look the same everywhere you go.
Yeah, and the idea of the United States as the binding agent is a fascinating one. And so one wonders, right, if the United States were not active in a region, or if the United States chose to withdraw from certain regions of the world, would that then encourage competition between Russia and China?
Well, the region of the world, of the four that I looked at, the region in which the U.S. footprint is the smallest is Central Asia. And when I talk about Central Asia, I mean the 5 republics of the former Soviet Union that are in Central Asia. So Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan.
Yes.
The U.S. footprint, especially after the end of the 2014 end of Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, and certainly since the 2021 full withdrawal, The U.S. footprint and interest in that region has declined significantly, especially the military footprint. There essentially is no military footprint there now, and we really don't have a lot of we're not pursuing a lot of high order economic interests there either. Our strategy there is, I think, what it should be, and it's all about encourage, democracy, civil society, regional cooperation, stability, those types of things. But if you look at Central Asia, of the 4 regions I looked at, that's where the Chinese and Russian competition is heating up most obviously. And the competition right now is really focused in the economic realm, economic competition between the two of them. The old paradigm for Central Asia, there's a great article, Warren Iraq's article from years ago called The Sheriff and the Banker, right? And that's the paradigm about Russia's the sheriff, China's the banker in Central Asia. That was true for a long time, but China's economic engagement was largely through the Belt and Road Initiative. Kazakhstan is where Xi Jinping announced the BRI in 2013. It was his first post-COVID foreign visit was to Kazakhstan and then Uzbekistan for Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. So it matters greatly, Central Asia does, to China economically, but it obviously matters to Russia as well. And so what you're seeing now in Central Asia is increasingly China is certainly economically more comfortable with establishing strong economic ties with the 5 Central Asian states that exclude Russia, and in some cases that are zero sum, at Russia's expense, especially when it comes to pipelines, hydrocarbons, which all used to go out because of the way the Soviet economic system was set up. Everything went out through Russia. And now increasingly there are pipelines going to China. There are pipelines the Russians would like to build, Power of Siberia 2, that the Chinese right now are stalling on. So there's evidence, at least in the economic sense, that they're becoming competitors in Central Asia. And I think China is now maybe less willing to just cede the security space to Russia altogether, because China believes it has security interests in Central Asia too that are mostly related to its western region of Xinjiang, which borders several of the Central Asian states, and the concern of instability or terrorism, religious extremism emanating from Afghanistan. And it's a very short trip from the Afghan border to the Chinese border across Tajikistan. And so China's only their second foreign military base. The first is in Djibouti. So we can get to Africa later, but the second is in a remote mountainous region of Tajikistan between the Afghan and Chinese borders called Gorno-Badakhshan. And to this point, the Russians haven't said anything publicly about it. They're not upset about it. China and Tajikistan spent years denying the base existed. It became impossible to deny it just because it's all over satellite photos. I mean, the photos are good enough that you can see it's Chinese security forces. It's officially not a PLA base, it's a People's Armed Police base. So it's not a military base, it's a security base, but nevertheless, it's only China's second overseas military or security base.
Well, yeah, and in general, when we talk about Chinese Western provinces and the border with Xinjiang, right, the line between security police and military is heavily blurred in any case. So for the audience, please remember that while I'm happy to throw questions at Bob, you're welcome to throw some too. Please use the Q&A feature of the webinar in order to do that. And while you're all thinking of questions, I'm going to throw one at Bob, which is, how much of the current relationship between, because we'll come back to particular regions and the rivalries, what role do the personalities of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping play? Is this alliance or this cooperation as strong as it is because of their approach to it, or are there longer term bureaucratic or interests that are more important than the role of these individual leaders?
Short answer, yes, to both.
Good.
So yeah, I would say that the personal relationship between Xi Jinping and Putin was a catalyst. It established sort of an initial bond. These are men who both see both their roles in their countries in similar ways, and also see their relationship with the US in similar ways, and also see global order or international order in similar ways. So each of them sees themselves, they're very concerned with legacy.
Hmm.
Each of them believes, I think, and wants to be included among the great leaders of their countries. Putin's role models are Peter the Great and Stalin are the two that he references, most commonly or most frequently. But Xi Jinping sees himself, I think, also as a transformational figure in China's history, and so there's that. They
Hmm.
see themselves in similar ways. Um, they see their relationship with the U.S. in similar ways. They believe that the United States threatens their internal stability and controls their external freedom of action, and they don't like it. Uh, they see the international system in the same way, in that it's about power and polarity, and not laws, norms, institutions. Right. So these are realists. These are political science realists that believe power, economic and military power, are the currency of international relations, um, and that the United States is a declining hegemon that's trying to preserve its hegemony, but that hegemony is destined to decline and will be replaced by a multipolar system. So I think those three things, the personal relationship, the way they see themselves in their countries, the way they see their relationship with the US, and the way they see international order, have been the primary causes of at least the beginning of their building of a really a stronger, more resilient relationship between Russia and China than we've seen in the past. Now, they've also institutionalized it. So there are now commissions, committees, and sort of standing bodies of interaction below the levels of the two presidents that meet regularly. So there is an institutionalization of the relationship going on that may provide it with a little bit sort of a shock absorber if Putin or Xi Jinping were to leave the system suddenly. But these are authoritarian regimes, and they're increasingly personalist authoritarian regimes. So the sudden departure of one would, no matter the level of institutionalization, will affect the relationship in a significant way. And who
Right.
replaces the one who departs will also it'll have a major effect on the relationship.
That's a and that's the great imponderable, right? We don't know how, or we won't know exactly what effect one of their departure would have until one of them departs.
Yeah, I'm rooting for Putin and soon.
That's fair.
That's just me, maybe.
That's right. I'll kick in on that, right? If you're raising money for that. But Fritz Heinzen has a question that I was curious about the militarization of the borders in the Far East, especially the Russia China border, right? You talked about the border clashes 1969. You talked about how the Chinese are worried about what's going on there. What's the state of Russian militarization of those border regions? Do the Russians still have forces out that way?
That's a great question. So I don't have specific detail on that.
Sure.
My understanding, though, in my sense, at the sort of national or military strategic level,
Mm-hmm.
is that the center of gravity of Russian military deployments. Let's leave Ukraine aside, but even
Sure.
before Ukraine, Russia's threat perceptions have led it to mostly focus on its southern and western borders. Southern, the borders in the Caucasus, and the borders with the Central Asian states, and the western borders, obviously the borders with Eastern European countries, because Russia
Mm-hmm.
saw that the threats emanating from those two places. From the south, the concern was terrorism, religious extremism, narcotics trafficking, all those sort of non-state threats. From the West, the perception was of a state-based threat.
Mm-hmm.
And so the China-Russia border, I think, is much less militarized than it has been probably than it was throughout the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is Russia just doesn't have the threat perception from China that it does from its southern neighbors and western neighbors. And part of it is Russia has had to move so many forces to Ukraine that even with all the mobilizations they've done, they don't have a lot of spare forces to put on other borders.
Right. Well, and so in that sense, right, there is a very clear practical interest that the Russians have in good relations with the Chinese, so they don't have to worry about that border.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. So it's in Russia's interest at this point to maintain a functional relationship with China, because it does not have the luxury now of having to militarize its border with China. It just doesn't have the capacity to do that militarily. As engaged as it is in Ukraine, And it even had to pull, early on after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, I saw a number of somewhere around 80% of the Russian forces that had been opposite the Baltics and Finland, the Baltics and Nordic countries had been deployed to Ukraine. So even those borders where Russia at least formally claims it perceives a threat from NATO, those have been largely, or were largely, cleared of major Russian forces to support Ukraine. So it just does not have the luxury right now of having the relationship with China degrade to the point where it needs to worry about security on that border.
Which leads to a question that's an anonymous attendee asks that I also happen to have on my list. And that is, there are some people who've argued that it should be an American strategy to try to drive a wedge between China and Russia, either by consciously choosing to improve relations with one. Obviously, this was one of the motivations of Nixon and Kissinger back in 1972. This has been an argument made, especially by people who say we shouldn't be supporting Ukraine because we should be making nice with the Russians so that they can help us with the Chinese. What do you think, based on your understanding of the relationship, what are the chances of such a strategy bearing fruit in the immediate term?
I would say almost nil, almost nothing. So you'll hear people talk about the Trump administration sort of, this is the grand strategic end state or outcome that the Trump administration approach to China and Russia, that what they're after is a reverse Kissinger, right? That's the term that, that we hear now. I don't see space for that. Look, Kissinger and Nixon were able to do what they were able to do in the early 1970s because they became aware that there had been a fracture in the Soviet Union PRC relationship. They then exploited that fracture or that gap. Yeah. So right now, there's no fracture or gap to exploit. Yes, there's competition in certain places, but there's not. They're not shooting at each other across the border like they were in 1969. Right. They don't see each other right now as significant security threats as they did in the 60s and late 60s and early 70s. And so there's no gap for us to exploit. And every time we do, every time I hear an American policymaker or senior military leader say, we need to drive a wedge between the Russians and the Chinese, I shake my head, because all we do when we enter the equation is drive them together. And so my sense is we need to, you started off at the beginning, Ron, by talking about the way the U.S. national security community has sort of habitually seen these two countries, whereas China is the pacing challenge, right? You'll hear the military say that. The Biden national security strategy said it's the only country with both the capability and the will to rewrite the rules of international order, right? All that's true. Yep. China is a long-term challenge to the United States. At this point, it's not a militarized challenge, and I don't think it has to become a militarized challenge. Russia is an acute militarized threat to European and Euro-Atlantic security. It has been a core tenet of U.S. national security policy since the end of the Second World War that, given the size, population, and concentration of resources in broader Europe or Europe and Eurasia, the emergence of a hegemonic power there would be a grave threat to U.S. national security interests. We can argue over whether Russia has hegemonic capability, but it certainly has hegemonic intent. And if it wins in Ukraine, my sense is its capability will be expanded significantly, and then it will not stop there. So I spent most of my career arguing that what we were calling Russian aggression, in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014, even the Syria intervention in 2015, was mostly defensive and limited. And I can't make that argument now. After February of 2022, there's no way, I think, to responsibly make an argument that Russia's invasions of its neighbors, its serial intervention in its neighbors, crossing of its borders with military forces, is anything other than an attempt to reestablish as much of the Russian Empire or Soviet Union as it can. So it's an inability to deal with its own post-imperial state and become a normal state, normal European country.
Right. It's not interested in that right now, at least.
No.
Well, there are a couple of questions dealing with third countries that you don't mention in your book, which I want to ask them first, then eventually want to get to Africa. And that is one Roger Gelfond asks about the relationship between North Korea and Russia, China? Does this make a difference in their relationship? And Nirmal Verma asks about India. And I know that India plays a particularly interesting role because of its longstanding economic and energy ties to Russia,
Right.
along with its rivalry with the Chinese. So in 5 minutes or less, right? But how do you see those relationships fitting into this larger partnership?
Yeah, those are both great questions, because those are both important countries, right? And I talk a little in the book about the Korean Peninsula, on North Korea. So Liz Wishnick, recently we had an event and she did a report on this exact question, the Russia-China North Korea relationship. And it's a great report. And the event is on the FPRI webpage. You can look at, you can see, but her sense, and I agree with this, and Liz is a real expert in the Russia-China relationship generally, but also sort of the North Korea factor, is that there are serious obstacles to some sort of trilateral axis among China, Russia, and North Korea that exist, and it's unlikely in the near future. And there may be a little, I don't know what the word, not recalcitrance, but a little bit, and not suspicion, but just a little discomfort in Beijing at how close China, Russia, and North Korea have gotten since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So my sense is that, and I think Liz agrees in her report, that it's unlikely that China, Russia, and North Korea are going to become, some sort of axis, trilateral axis, and that if anything, China is a little concerned about the burgeoning Russia-North Korea relationship, not necessarily because it feels left out, but I think because there's this sense that it may make North Korea a little more risk acceptant and risk tolerant if it believes it has backing from Russia. And it believes it's earned that backing, right, by all the artillery shells, all the ballistic missiles, all the, over 10,000 soldiers that have fought against Ukrainian forces for Russia. So then you have I think probably in Beijing, there's a little bit of moral hazard concern that if the North Koreans are already a little bit unpredictable and a little bit much more tolerant of risk than I think the Chinese would like them to be, and they may become even less predictable and more tolerant of risk, given the implicit assumption that they have Russian backing.
And I can see that being an interesting question. The idea that North Korea has, since there's been a North Korea, has been an interesting apple of discord between the Chinese and the Russians. So I guess it's not surprising. On India, and this actually, let me use this as a way to bend in another question that's been thrown out there by Irina Gigova about the concept of a multipolar world. Right. So if the Russians and the Chinese talk about the world should be multipolar, that generally is mainly aimed at the United States shouldn't be the only pole. But how many poles do they really imagine there being? Right? Is it are they thinking we want in this club? Because one gets the impression, for example, that for the Chinese, what they really want to see is a bipolar world where they are equal to the United States, right?
Yep.
And the Russians kind of want that too, but they can't both have a bipolar world with the other guy helping them to do it. So then what do you do with a country like India? Because the Indians talk about, we had TV Paul on here on the show a couple months ago talking about Indian foreign policy. The Indians talk about a multipolar world because they imagine that that's a world in which India is one of those poles. And yet, so broadly speaking, right, I mean, is there any sense that the Russians and the Chinese, or is this just something they table for another time? They don't want to let it get in the way of their relations now? Or how do they imagine this future multipolar world?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, that the view from Beijing is that the emerging international order is bipolar, with China and the US being the major poles, and then other smaller poles sort of almost as like planets or satellites orbiting them. That's obviously not the view in Moscow.
Right.
I think the Russians are pragmatic enough that they envision a multipolar world. They understand that it can't be Moscow and Washington that are the poles. They understand that you can't relegate China, a country that big and with power growing that quickly, to the status of a junior partner to Russia anymore. So, but then you've got a fundamental disconnect between the view from Moscow and the view from Beijing, where the view from Moscow is of a multipolar world where China is another pole that's on Russia's side. But then, as you said, maybe there are other poles. The Russians have a good relationship with India, and they historically have. They would be happy for New Delhi to be a pole. But the Chinese don't see it that way. I really believe that the Chinese believe that when it really comes down to power and influence around the world, there's only two. And so that is something that, if this relationship does continue to build and does evolve into some true strategic partnership, that problem has to be worked out, because it's a pretty serious problem. Now, I would say too that anytime we're talking power and polarity and everything, we're speaking a language that, at least historically, the United States has not spoken, right? We don't speak the language of power and polarity. We speak the language of laws, norms, and institutions. Now, our competitors would say that's a fig leaf for U.S. unilateralism and hegemony. That what we really want, we say we want a rules-based order or a liberal world order or whatever, but those are really just fig leaves for the U.S. doing what it wants and running the system and dictating to other countries. But I think, we can talk about the Trump administration, but it's the first administration in my adult lifetime, certainly, that has very blatantly and nakedly spoken the language of power.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, first Trump administration talked about great power competition. Even the Obama administration, Biden administration talked about great power competition, but it was competition within a system that we still said was regulated imperfectly, but nevertheless regulated by institutions, laws, and norms of conduct in international relations. We're not speaking that language anymore. I mean, we're talking about taking over Greenland, Canada, the Panama Canal, all these, that's Russian language. That's Chinese language. That is sphere of influence language. So it's a different language than we've spoken. So it remains to be seen going forward, when we talk about world order, whether the U.S. will continue to defend or a rules-based order, or even argue that there is one, or whether the U.S. will try to establish a securitized or militarized sphere of influence in its own hemisphere. I think that would be a huge mistake, because it would it plays into the Chinese and Russian narrative. It undercuts any sort of legitimacy we have as an upholder of the rules. And secondly, look, the only thing that all great power concerts have in common throughout history is they all have ended in great power war. So they always break down at some point.
Now that's an excellent point and a sobering thought. I was thinking about this when you were talking about the idea about what poles would exist or who would come out on top. You talked about the sheriff and the banker in Central Asia, and when I hear that paradox, or when I hear that metaphor, I should say, it occurs to me that it is easier for a banker to become a sheriff too than it is for a sheriff to become a banker. Right. That if you're rich enough and you're interested in a region, you will build up the military capabilities to do so. But if you're economically weak, but militarily strong, it's hard to become the banker and the sheriff. And this gets to a question that was raised by Isabelle Mansuy, a question of, if Russia becomes economically increasingly dependent on China, or let's say economically weaker because of the money that it's spending on Ukraine, but also just because of the realities of the Russian economy and Russian society. Is this a fatal flaw in any Russian plan to imagine a multipolar world, that eventually they're just going to fall behind the United States and China?
Yeah, and that's a fair question. And it's one I think a lot of people are wrestling with. So I would say this. Yes, it's true that Russia cannot compete across the instruments of power, diplomatic, information, military, economic, with the US or with China. But it has shown a capacity to regenerate, to survive and regenerate its military and economic power, that I think has surprised a lot of people. In the wake of the war in Ukraine, the amount of damage that the Ukrainians have done to the Russian military is staggering. But there are more than 2 times as many Russian forces in Ukraine now as there were in February 2022. Right. So the Russians have lost the number, the estimates vary, but somewhere in the order of 600 to 800,000 people in Ukraine, between those killed, missing, or wounded badly enough that they can't return soon to the fight. It has lost massive, over 50% in some cases, of its pre-war stocks of major systems like tanks, armored personnel carriers, artillery. It has more than regenerated its personnel losses. It's stronger in Ukraine than it was when it invaded. It's been able, through using old Soviet stocks, to refurbish and refit and replace its losses in tanks and armored personnel carriers and things like that. And it's been more economically resilient than we thought it would be, because Putin spent 8 years sanctions proofing the economy from February, from early 2014 with the seizure of Crimea and the Russian fomenting of a war in eastern Ukraine until February 2022. I think he understood that when he did what he knew he was going to do at some point to Ukraine, that the sanctions would get a lot more stringent, draconian, and damaging. And so he did a pretty good job. And you got to admit that the Russian central bank has done an amazing job in the 3+ years of the war in stabilizing the currency, and in insulating Russia from the economic shocks of Western sanctions. Now, that said, I don't think the current model of generation of military power and sustaining economic power, I don't think it can be sustained. I think and most of the people I talk to who are experts in the Russian defense industry and the economy and others will say there's going to be a tipping point. When it comes, we don't know. It could be as early as 9 months, could be as long as 3 or 4 years. But the current model of generating power, military and economic power, is unsustainable for Russia.
I guess that's one of those things we'll have you back when we'll see when that happens. Let's shift because I want to talk about Africa. I feel like it's an area of the world that's very important. Rory Page asks a particular question about the role of Russian private military and security companies and Chinese similar organizations in Africa. But that also builds into a larger question of, you talk a great deal about your chapter on Africa about the intensity of Chinese, the banker sheriff option or metaphor seems especially strong there. And how should we think about the way that China and Russia are behaving in Africa, both towards the Africans and towards each other, especially in light of the fact of recent stories that suggest that the current administration is looking to drastically slash American interest in and representation in Africa?
Right. So, I chose Africa for a couple of reasons. One, you've got increasing presence and interest by both Russia and China in Africa. Two, they have unequal influence, though, in diverging goals for Africa, which sort of tests their ability to cooperate there. And then another thing that tests their ability to cooperate is the fairly light U.S. footprint, which is going to apparently get even lighter, as you noted. So we do have a U.S. Africa command, a military command, although it's not in Africa, it's in Germany. And we do have diplomatic and economic presence in Africa, as well as military presence, but all that looks to decline in fairly quickly. So I sort of used cooperation, compartmentalization, competition as a way to characterize how Russia and China interact across these different regions in the book. Africa was a place where I think it's more compartmentalized or compartmented. So each is on the continent, each is aware of that the other is there and what the other is doing, and they essentially just stay out of each other's way. And I think they're geographically and functionally they operate differently in Africa. So geographically, China is focused on the Horn of Africa and the Gulf of Guinea, because those are their export routes, right? They're ocean export routes, and especially the Gulf of Guinea. It's a major hydrocarbons export route because the Nigerian hydrocarbon industry, and both of them have been beset by instability, piracy, terrorism, and so the whole the Chinese view of development in Africa is that the Belt and Road Initiative is Africa's a very big part of the PRI. And the Belt and Road Initiative is a very big part of the PRI. And the Belt and Road Initiative is Africa's a very big part of the PRI. And the Belt and Road Initiative is very big part of the PRI. And the Belt and Road Initiative is Africa's a very big part of the PRI. is that development leads to stability, and without development, you can't have stability. And so China is focused on economic development through the Belt and Road Initiative and its other initiatives like the Global Development Initiative. And it's focused regionally on the Horn of Africa and the Gulf of Guinea. Russia is focused on military power, although it's unorthodox or unconventional military power, primarily in the form of what used to be the Wagner Group. It's now called the Africa Corps, but it's still Russian private military
Wait, is it really called
contractors.
the Africa Corps?
Yeah, yes,
Okay.
they launched the Africa Corps, which is really just it's the Wagner Group rebranded, and there's also a couple other private military companies, Russian PMCs, that have been sort of brought under that umbrella. It was an attempt to, obviously, everyone remembers what happened in June of 2023, where we had the March on Moscow. Yevgeny Prigozhin led the Wagner Group on essentially on an attack, and captured 2 Russian cities before they stood the attack down, and then Prigozhin was killed in a plane crash, clearly orchestrated by the Kremlin. But anyway, Russia is focused on military presence, and it's focused mostly on the Sahel, because that's where a lot of the sort of instability in the form of insurgency, terrorism, and all these things is most prevalent. And that's an opportunity for Russia through the Wagner Group, through the Africa Corps, to gain influence, to push the West out. So the Russians were critical to the U.S. being invited to leave Niger, to the UN and the French being invited to leave Mali. And then that creates space for the Wagner Group to move in and not only, quote unquote, provide security, but also they often do that in exchange for economic concessions, often mineral rights, gold, diamond mines, things like that. And so they're just doing different things in Africa, but they generally have stayed out of each other's way. As I said, each is aware that the other is there, but there does not appear to be much cooperation, and certainly no apparent competition.
And if we have, going back to the idea of the United States as the binding agent, right? So if we're not there, does that, do we just imagine that they'll continue to stay out of each other's way for as long as they can?
Yeah, I think the smaller the U.S. footprint and presence is, the more space emerges for competition, frankly. That's what you see in Central Asia. Now, I'm not arguing that, hey, let's stop all of our humanitarian assistance, security assistance to Africa so the Chinese and Russians will compete there. That is a sort of really cynical way to look at the world, and I would not ever advocate for that. I think it's a mistake to draw down our assistance effort in Africa, or whether it's economic development or security assistance. I think it's a mistake. I think we'll pay for it in the long term. But in the short to midterm, what it might do is create some space for increased Chinese-Russian competition, because again, when we're there, we drive them together. When we're out of the equation, other interests and other influences start to sort of come to the fore.
Well, and this gets to one of the really big questions about American foreign security policy in the future. And that is, in an era of constrained resources and an awareness of the limits of American power, are there parts of the world that the United States should be comfortable letting somebody else worry about?
Yeah.
Jeff Steele asked this question broadly about, should we focus on our backyard? But I guess it all depends on, what's our backyard, right? How big is our backyard? But in general, right? Are there parts of the world that it makes good strategic sense for the United States to say, this is outside of our security perimeter, to use an old term?
Oh, yeah. There's the Korean War analogy. Yeah,
indeed.
So get a Sharpie and go to a map. Security, yes. Okay. I would say, look, I think our approach to Central Asia is largely right. And we have a strategy that was unveiled in the first Trump administration. And, I'm sort of on record as not having been much of a fan of that administration, and less one of this Trump administration. But I think they got Central Asia right. The strategy, if you read it, it's about, encouraging political and economic development and regional cooperation. And it's very much focused on the Chinese always say win-win cooperation, but if you look at our Central Asia policy, that's really what it's about. Since we don't identify, after the Afghanistan war has been over, we've not identified any real significant security interests or threats emanating from there that would require us to base military forces there. When we have military forces, defense attaché offices and the offices of defense cooperation and all the embassies there. But again, it's mostly about assistance in political development, social development, economic development, and regional cooperation, which is something that I think, from the perspective of the 5 Central Asian states, having an external power that encourages regional cooperation is a really big, it's seen very favorably by the Central Asian governments, because the other external powers, the big ones that are present in the region, China and Russia, often discourage regional cooperation or even intentionally try to create regional instability or competition between the Central Asian states, because it's easier than, if you're the Chinese or the Russians, to deal with 5 individual countries where your power advantage is greater than to deal with them as a regional bloc or a regional grouping. So I think we have Central Asia about right. And what you're seeing there is, I think, you are seeing developing regional cooperation. You're not seeing a lot of democratic development, but the United States, I think this is an area where we probably should be fairly patient and just and let that move at its own pace. But the narrative needs to be about why democracy is the best form of government, why democracies are more stable, why it's better for not only the government but the people. But in the meantime, encouraging regional cooperation, encouraging economic development, and all those things, I think it's a pragmatic strategy that doesn't over leverage or overcommit us. That's the argument when the advocates of pragmatism or restraint or realism, whatever you want to call it, their concern is legitimate. It's that the United States is permanently overextended. Because we see ourselves as a sheriff in every part of the world, right? Not just our own backyard. And so, to the extent that we can make some hard pragmatic choices there, we should, especially with the deployment of military power, because that's the thing really that gets people's, the hair on the back of the necks of people in Beijing and Moscow and other places stand up when the U.S. drops a military base somewhere. But in terms of economic or even diplomatic effort, it doesn't raise the alarm that military effort does.
We are just about to the end, and there are still multiple questions out there to be answered. But I think I want to ask a big one to sort of wrap up. And this branches off a question Lance Morgan asks about, well, should we move away from poles and embrace the clash of civilizations? But it gets to this larger question of how do you imagine foreign policy and international relations, geopolitics? How do you imagine it being organized in the future, right? Where are the fault lines? Because there are certainly, the Biden administration tried to say it was democracies against autocracies. You have some people, the Chinese and the Russians would talk about multiple poles. You still do have folks out there who want to fight civilizational wars, although thankfully they are less loud than they were, say, around from 2001 to 2010. How do you imagine the world organizing itself, right? What if any ideas, what should we be looking for or thinking about? And is this complicated China-Russia relationship a kind of model for the sort of not quite completely fitting together forms of government, but similarities, but different cultures, different histories, different rivalries, just organizing themselves differently? What's the world going to be like, Bob?
Yeah. So to Lance's clash of civilizations premise. Look, Huntington was clearly onto something. But he assigned Russia and Ukraine to the same civilization in that book. And they're now fighting a war to the death.
Yeah.
So, and that book took a largely sort of religious view of international relations. I like it. It's useful. But like any one of these sort of, models at a high level of abstraction, it's limited in its ability to explain or certainly to predict outcomes. Whether it's democracies versus autocracies, or I would even maybe frame it as liberal versus illiberal. And I don't mean liberal in the U.S. sense. I mean the classic sense of individual rights, limited government, free trade, that those a Kantian sort of view, or if you want to look at the Economist magazine's view of how the world works,
Mhm.
is one. And then there's an illiberal view, which is typified, I think, by Russia and China, but also by Hungary and Turkey and India and possibly the United States.
Right.
The United States has moved maybe to the illiberal side of the ledger, where it's a backlash against classical liberalism. So, and how does Bob think the world should be organized? We got it right in 1945.
Mhm.
We got it right. I mean, the entire premise of the U.S. post-war order, it was based on the assumption that, so our power now is unchallenged in 1945, unchallenged in every respect. But we understood that that wasn't going to be the situation forever. That both our former allies uh, and our defeated adversaries were going to regain their power, and that we should sort of institutionalize the global order so that when they regain their power, we should voluntarily cede some of our power to institutions. Not all, clearly, because
Mhm.
we've gone around the institutions sometimes.
Sure.
When we thought we had critical national security interests at stake, but by voluntarily ceding some of our power to institutions, then we would it was an insurance policy against when the Germans and when the Japanese and when the French or the British or the Soviets, when they regain their power, that they would work within those institutions and not challenge them and not challenge us directly. And so I think we got it right. Now the institutions are incredibly flawed and they need to be reformed, but I don't think they need to be discarded sort of on the ash heap of history on the altar of now naked great power competition, because that I do believe that the system we set up in 1945 prevented wars, prevented a number of wars. We had plenty of wars during the Cold War, but they tend to be smaller insurgencies or small power wars, not great power wars. The fact that we've not had a great power war since 1945, I think, is largely due to the system we set up then. We need to fix that system and not abandon it.
I like that kind of clear statement in favor of a successful international order that's so successful that people have forgotten that it had to be created.
That's exactly right. We've taken it for granted now. We assume that just things are this way, and we can ignore the institutions and violate the laws, and everything will be fine. It won't.
Won't. So that's both a clear-eyed but ultimately hopeful vision, I guess. Right? We can hopefully get these institutions going. Bob Hamilton, it has been a delight to have you here on People, Politics, and Prose. Thank you so much for being on the program.
It's been my pleasure, Ron. Thank you so much for the invitation. Great to see you again.
Great to see you, and thanks to all of you for tuning in, for watching. Right, the farewell tour continues. Right, this is probably the penultimate episode of People, Politics, and Prose. We have one more coming up in May. Watch this space for that information. Please, if however you like programs like this, right, FPRI has plenty of other ones, so consider becoming a member, partner, ally, supporter of the great system created by FPRI, so that we can continue to have conversations like this one. The world goes on, and FPRI wants to help you understand every twist and turn. If you've enjoyed this discussion, tell a friend about FPRI. Bring a friend to future shows. Tell other people about our offerings. To keep up with future events at FPRI, visit our website, fpri.org. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter or X. You can follow the host of this program on X at Ronald Granieri. That's all we have for today. For all of us at FPRI, I am indeed Ron Granieri, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.